And hello everyone, my name is Daniel Frierson and welcome back to the channel. You might remember in October of 2025 I put together this budget gaming rig capable of modern 1080p gaming for less than $60 US. Well, it's about time we gave it a little upgrade because we had money to spare in that budget there. You might remember we had a PS4 as well as a spare graphics card that I mentioned you could sell on to offset some of the budget and put a few upgrades into this rig. Well, we also had a spare CPU, because if you upgrade the CPU, the old one suddenly becomes spare. So if you sell the PS4, the graphics card, and the i5 2500K that we were already using, suddenly you have 30 British pounds to spend on upgrading the 41 British pound gaming rig. Yeah, so that gave me a lot of budget to play with, so I spent it wisely. I went from the i5 2500K to the 3570K, which is still only a quad-core CPU, but it is a generational improvement as well as a smaller process node, and also supporting PCIe Gen 3, it should alleviate some GPU bottlenecks here. Now, speaking of the GPU bottlenecks and PCIe Gen 3, I need to mention, we are not using the original motherboard anymore. That thing died as soon as I started overclocking the 2500K. Must have been on its last legs. I don't know what its history was. So I've swapped in a spare that I had on hand. It doesn't give me any performance boost or advantage here. I have just swapped in a similar model of motherboard to replace the one that I lost, because I wasn't going to waste money on buying an identical replacement, especially when I already had one. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. Now, I was able to upgrade that CPU for £7 British. That gave me 23 British pounds to spend on more important things. Because yes, alleviating our CPU bottleneck is important, but there was also a massive bottleneck that we hadn't even addressed in that first video. And that was the SSD. The original SSD I was using is a Patriot Burst 120GB DRAM cashless drive, which means that for all intents and purposes, yes, read and write speeds are going to be faster than a hard drive, especially random reads and writes. Access times aren't actually that much improved because it's constantly running out of buffer to load any of this data that you're trying to get from the drive, and a DRAM cashless drive, especially in game load times, usually isn't that much improved over a hard drive. It is improved over a hard drive when you're running, say, Windows off of the drive, but this is a game storage drive as well as our boot drive, so that needed to be swapped in for a higher capacity, because 120 gigs, especially when Windows 11 already takes up the first 30, it's just not enough, especially if you want to have more than one video game load off the SSD. And yeah, we needed more than one video game on the SSD. Dead Space Remake and Resident Evil 4 definitely benefit from being on an SSD. The hitches and stutters went down massively once I put them on an SSD. So I went with a 240 gig SanDisk drive that I bought used for 12 British pounds. Which leaves me with 11 British pounds to upgrade the one last limiting factor in that original setup, and that's the cooler. You might recall in the original video, we were using an Intel stock cooler, much like this one. I don't know where the one I was actually using back then went. It's been 3 months, I'm sorry. I just have this spare. Intel stock coolers are kind of trash, and if you work with PCs regularly, you're going to end up with a lot of them. Anyway, we were using an Intel stock cooler. It wasn't even a nice copper cord Intel stock cooler. It was an all aluminium one, or aluminum, however you want to say it. Okay, yes, I've been westernized. Sorry. We needed to swap that cooler, and with only £11 of the budget left, I wasn't expecting to get a good deal, especially on anything that was actually capable of overclocking on. Well, I was very lucky, as it turns out. And I was able to find a Noctua L9i on eBay in 2019 for 44 British pounds. Yes, okay, this is not the cooler I bought. I actually bought a Noctua L... I'm going to have to check the model number of that, because I don't know. I actually bought a Noctua U9S, which is definitely not a cooler that was going to fit in this case. And because it didn't fit, and I really wanted the side panel to go on there, I put the U9S in my Plex server, and I swapped in the cooler from that Plex server to this chassis, because a long while ago my Plex server was in a 3U server chassis, so it already had a 3U compatible Noctua cooler in there, and it was just a convenience thing to be able to close the side panel and actually use this as a desktop that isn't just exposed to the air constantly. Wasn't going to get that much of a performance difference swapping from a U9S to an L9i. They are very similarly capable coolers, but the U9S is slightly taller than the L9i, so I had to swap to the shorter cooler if I wanted to get the side panel on, and that's what I did. Regardless, I managed to buy that U9S at auction for £8.98, plus £4.99 shipping, so if you include the shipping price, I'm over budget. But if you ignore the shipping price, and unlike me, if you had a car that you could go and pick things up in person, you'd have to adjust for fuel cost, but I think it's fair to say that I didn't go over budget, or maybe I did. I went over budget by £3, I'm sorry. It's a 44 British pound gaming PC now. Regardless, we are using a much better SSD, we're using a newer and faster CPU, and what are the performance improvements like? Well, before we get to the slideshow of all the benchmarks I ran, I need to first talk about overclocking. Because yes, that first motherboard died when I overclocked the 2500K, but obviously I was overclocking the 2500K, so I've run benchmarks with that overclock, and the overclock I was able to get was pretty exceptional. 4.9 gigahertz. 4.9 gigahertz on a second gen i5 2500K. It sucked back 92 watts of power at 4.9 gigahertz. It's a shame it wasn't a second gen i7, because hyperthreading would have definitely benefited us in certain games, mainly Clair Obscur Expedition 33, though a lot of the bottlenecks in Expedition 33 are actually just hitting the 3 gig frame buffer on the GPU. Yeah, we ran out of VRAM in Expedition 33. We don't run out of VRAM in Dead Space 2023, surprisingly, considering that that is a more graphically demanding game. I'm not entirely sure how we don't run out of VRAM in Dead Space, but we do in Clair Obscur, so performance, especially on the 0.1% lows, isn't massively improved in Clair Obscur, but it is improved still. But yeah, we are still suffering with this 3 gig GTX 1060. It's a shame it wasn't a 6 gig one, and in fact, if you were able to build this system with a 6 gig GTX 1060 or a similarly capable card with a higher frame buffer than 3 gigs, this would perform much better than it actually does right now, because the CPU isn't the bottleneck anymore. VRAM is, which is lovely, and also DDR3. Yeah, we've moved on to DDR5 now. DDR3 is 2 generations old. And yes, okay, DDR5 prices are absurd right now, as well as DDR4. DDR3 is still okay. It is going up as DDR4 goes up, but it is still available, at least. So you can still buy it, but I would advise against it. Buy DDR4 if you can. And yes, I know DDR4 is getting more expensive, but it's still cheaper than DDR5. So yes, I was able to overclock the 2500K to 4.9 GHz, which did alleviate a lot of the CPU bottlenecks we were experiencing with that chip, but since I overclocked the 2500K, before I swapped to the 3570K, I obviously need to overclock that as well. Now, unfortunately, the 3570K, or at least the chip that I had, is not as good at overclocking as the 2500K was. I wasn't able to match clock speeds. I was able to get 4.7 GHz stable, but it took almost 1.5 volts, which even this Noctua cooler could not handle. So for the sake of stability, thermals, and not killing another motherboard, I lowered the overclock to 4.6 GHz at roughly 1.37 volts, which is still higher than I would like, but it's still lower than what I would consider dangerous territory for overclocking, especially on an Intel chip of this generation. And 4.6 GHz is still much improved over the 3.8 that this chip boosts to at stock speeds, so it's an improvement. It's just not the 4.9 that I would have liked. If we were able to get 4.9 versus 4.9, you would really be able to see exactly how important it is to have a smaller chip process, as well as the IPC improvement of the newer 3570K. Unfortunately, it's not running at same clock speed, so that won't be as apparent. Anyway, I've talked at you long enough here, so let's just get to the benchmarks, shall we? So let's have a look at some synthetic benchmarks first to start things off. In 3D Mark Firestrike, our results speak for themselves. The 3570K at stock speeds is better than the 2500K, and the 3570K at 4.6 GHz just barely beats out the 2500K at 4.9, proving that this was a worthwhile upgrade, even though we couldn't match the frequency. Moving on to 3D Mark Timespy, it's the exact same story. The 2500K stock result is at the bottom, we have the 3570K stock result just edging that out, and then we have the overclocked 3570K giving us the best result out of the four. In Unigine Valley, at 1080p maximum settings, you can see that our overclocked 3570K got an average frame rate of 75.4, which means a total score of 3154. That is quite the improvement over the original result, which is way down at the bottom of the list. In Cinebench R15, just to test the raw computational performance of these CPUs, you can see that the 3570K and the 2500K at stock speeds pretty much perform the same in this test, but the 2500K at 4.9 GHz, because it has that little bit of an edge in frequency, does win overall. Though, looking at the 4.6 GHz result for the 3570K, you can see that there is obviously a performance increase here. So to start off the gaming benchmarks, we have Tomb Raider 2013, and you might notice that the 3570K stock result is at the top of the list. What's happening here? Well, these are in order of their average frame rates, but if you have a look at the minimums and the maximum, the 3570K at 4.6 GHz having the highest maximum result does mean that it's holding the GPU back the least, but all of these results are within margin of error, I would say, except for the 2500K, which definitely lost. So, regardless of your CPU, I'm pretty sure this game is going to run fine. Tomb Raider 2013 really doesn't care what CPU you have. I'm really just including this result, as useless as it appears, to show you how much of a performance increase we got by upgrading the CPU at all. In Clair Obscur Expedition 33 at 1080p with the low graphical preset XeSS set to balanced, as well as the ultimate performance mod installed, you can see that the results are a little bit confusing. Let me explain. They are in order of 1% lows. So the higher your 1% low, the smoother the gameplay is going to feel. That means it's a more important result than the average. That being said, the averages went up considerably by going to the 3570K. Our original result was 44 FPS, we went to 47 just by swapping the CPU, and then we got the same 44 FPS at 4.9 GHz, even though the 1% low improved quite considerably, but we got 52.3 FPS going to 4.6 GHz on the 3570K. So we're not holding back the GPU as much anymore, we are getting a higher average frame rate, but because we are hitting the 3 GB frame buffer limit on this 1060, we are not able to fix the issues we're having with those 1% lows. Moving on to Resident Evil 4 Remake, and you can see that we gained a lot of performance here. We gained 12 FPS in averages over our original result, as well as doubling our 1% lows and tripling our 0.1% lows, which basically means that the game was buttery smooth. Seriously, if we had the VRAM, I would have increased the graphical preset. Moving on to another remake, this time 2023's Dead Space remake, at 1080p low settings with FSR set to quality, we can see that we definitely improved our average frame rates by going to an overclocked 3570K, but our 0.1% and 1% lows are not all that much improved. Comparing the stock result to the 4.6 GHz 3570K, you can see that our 0.1% lows almost doubled, our 1% lows increased marginally, but our average FPS went up by 7. So the game did definitely run smoother, But despite running all of these tests 3 times and getting the average between them, we don't have the smoothest 1% lows here. And I'm not sure what's causing that in this case, because we're not hitting the frame buffer. The GPU wasn't pegged to 100% usage. We didn't run out of system memory. We're loading off of an SSD. This game just didn't perform as it should have done, and I can't explain why. It's very inconsistent. Moving on to Solstice at 1080p high settings, you can see that whether you're running an overclock or not, the 2500K loses in this game. The 3570K almost matches the average frame rate we got with that 4.9 GHz overclock at 60 compared to 61.3, but the 1% lows went up by 50%, and then a further 30% with our 4.6 GHz overclock, netting us a 25 frame per second 1% low and a 62.4 frame per second average. Again, all of these tests were run 3 times. This is an average result. So, wow, the game was actually playable now, because you might have noticed in the gameplay footage from the first video, it wasn't the smoothest. And finally, we have Dark Souls 3 running at 1080p absolute maximum settings. Now, Dark Souls 3 does have a 60 FPS frame cap, but that doesn't stop us from improving our 1% and 0.1% lows. And look at the 3570K results compared to the 2500K. Our 1% didn't improve massively, but our 0.1%, wow. I don't actually know how the results are this different, because again, it's loading off of an SSD. This is an aggregate result from 3 different benchmark runs, and we're not hitting the frame buffer. I mean, we're definitely not. This game doesn't even use 2 GB of VRAM at 1080p max. And I made sure to run this offline with most Windows background tasks disabled, so there shouldn't be anything hogging down the 2500K and making it look worse, but it was. So to show exactly how well the system upgrade performs overall, let's add all of those results together. Let's just add all the raw numbers together and put them in one big bar chart, and here it is. Overall, the 3570K performs roughly 10% better in every test than the 2570K did at stock speeds. See? It's a rough, on average, 10% performance bump to go to the overclocked 3570K. Even a stock 3570K is like a 4% performance bump, which is nothing to scoff about, really. That's not bad. But yeah, overclocking alleviates so much CPU overhead. It makes a massive difference, and now that we have this system running so well, why don't we actually show it playing a few games I didn't test in that first video? So we have seen how this system performs in the benchmarks that we ran in the original video, but how about looking at some games I didn't benchmark in that original video, namely Baldur's Gate 3. The constant 100% CPU usage is kind of concerning, because the temperatures are getting up there. 98, 99? Shut up, Driver Booster. Okay. So we're getting 40 FPS, which is decent, I guess. This mouse is not. Jesus Christ. I have just realized that I can't pan the camera. I literally cannot pan the camera. It won't let me. This mouse will not let me. So this is 1080p high. We're getting about 40 to 45 FPS here. Oh, 50. Not bad. But the constant load on our CPU is probably going to make us thermal throttle soon. I want to say this performs surprisingly well in Baldur's Gate 3. Better than I was expecting, I should say. Like, wow, we're getting... I'm impressed. Baldur's Gate 3 is a fairly well-optimized game, at least on the GPU side. It pegs CPUs pretty hard. But we are getting anywhere from 45 to 60 FPS in the Nautiloid anyway. We'll have to see how we are once we actually make land. But yeah, the CPU is not happy. The fact that it's running at 100% CPU usage is a little concerning. Oh no, what am I doing? The key's over here. Why is there no game audio? Because there are no speakers in this monitor. It's an artwork monitor. It's not a TV. This is surprisingly stable. I mean, look at the frame time here. It's pretty consistent. So for Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, dropping the overclock to 4.5 and lowering the voltage a tiny little bit would probably be useful. No, that's not dash. That's... What is the dash button again? Seriously, what is the dash button? Oh, dash requires an action. Why do I not have any action? What? Did I perform an action? I don't remember performing an action. Despite the fact that we are running the CPU at 100 degrees Celsius, and it is pretty much pegged at 100% usage, the game is running absolutely fine. I wouldn't trust this long term. I would definitely reduce that CPU overclock a little just to get the voltage down. I mean, we're only using about 60 watts, which the cooler should be able to handle. So this has to be voltage. Oh. The game just crashed. Okay. Well, it runs Baldur's Gate 3. I'll give it that. 1080p high settings, 40 to 60 FPS in the Nautiloid would probably drop down to about 35 FPS when you get to the Grove, just because of the amount of NPCs. I have no idea how it would perform in Act 3. Act 3 would probably perform horribly. Let's run Shadow of the Tomb Raider, because that has a built-in benchmark, which means I don't actually have to do anything. So let's see here. 1080p, XeSS off. We're going to try and run this native. We're going to turn MSA... No, I'm going to turn TAA to SMAA. I'm going to turn anti-aliasing down a notch, because I do not like TAA at all. And yeah, let's just try high with motion blur off. It's kind of a shame we're never going to see this design for Lara again. The next Tomb Raider game is going a bit more classic with her design, but I wouldn't say she looks any worse than she did before. This definitely isn't what I would imagine a 3D Lara Croft to look like. Lara from Tomb Raider Anniversary is pretty much the perfect 3D Lara, in my opinion. If you were going from the PS1 games to PS2 games, Tomb Raider Anniversary's Lara Croft design looked the best. Keeping with that design in this Crystal Dynamics trilogy would have been okay, but I understand why they changed the design. It fit the character to have, I suppose, a softer look, because she's quote-unquote innocent in the original. What the hell? Yeah, okay, this is definitely loading off a hard drive. Definitely loading off a hard drive. You probably wouldn't see like massive texture popping like that playing the game, because benchmarks like this swap between scenes really rapidly, which is kind of unfair. But yeah, definitely loading off a hard drive here. We got an average of 69 FPS. Nice. It would seem that the limiting factor is in fact the GPU. If you have a look down here at the bottom right, our CPU averaged 100 FPS, but our GPU averaged 72. So we have a disconnect there. But 95% of the time, we were staying above 67 FPS. That is pretty good, actually. That is amazing. So, yeah, it can run Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Elden Ring running at 1080p high at 50 FPS. That's not great. Yeah, that isn't great. Let's see what we can drop here. Let's drop AA a little bit and shadows. And drop reflections. Who cares about reflections? That is still 50 FPS. Okay. Let's just drop to the medium preset then, I guess. And turn motion blur off. Some settings won't apply until you restart. Oh, are we CPU limited? Yeah, we're going anywhere from 60 to 38. Seriously, it dropped to 38? And that is a CPU limitation. That is a CPU limitation. Okay, well, we found our true CPU bottleneck. It's Elden Ring. Wow. That's a shame. This is on the medium preset, which drops settings quite a bit more than I would have. It keeps water surface at high for some reason. But everything else is at medium. Yeah, some settings won't apply until I reset, but I'm not really sure that's going to make a massive difference here. We just dropped to 40 and it's not going back up. 38. I don't think it's going to go back up. Hey, give me that. Okay, so this time we should be on the medium preset. And we are. So let's see what happens now. I highly doubt the CPU overhead has gotten any better. Yeah. The frame rate just hasn't changed. The frame rate just hasn't improved. Oh, the shadows look terrible. That's nice. Foliage is gone. No, it really doesn't apply that many settings when you change it in-game. Yeah, so it plays Elden Ring. I don't know that this would be an enjoyable experience in Elden Ring, because you really want to be hitting 60 FPS, and the fact that we're being held back by the CPU is really disappointing. You piss off. Oh, I'm gonna get... Oh, he didn't kick me. What? I was standing behind you. It's a shame there's no riposte, because you can stagger. Oh, I really need a shield. Ow. No. Okay. Right, well, I've pretty much seen all I need to see there. We are severely CPU bottlenecked in Elden Ring. And unfortunately, there's just no way to fix that. I'm not actually sure that going to an i7 on this platform would improve performance. You would probably have to upgrade to a newer socket and newer CPUs. I do have an LGA 1151 motherboard that I got for free a few months ago. I can't include it in this gaming rig because any CPU for that socket would blow the budget out of the water. But I do have a 6th gen compatible motherboard. It's only Skylake compatible. I know LGA 1151 was also Kaby Lake, but it's not Kaby Lake compatible. Point is, with Elden Ring, apparently, you need to get off of any DDR3 compatible platform. It just doesn't perform, unfortunately. The 1060 isn't the problem here. The problem is the CPU, and that is disappointing. Although that does mean that we could increase the quality back to high and turn off motion blur again. Yeah, some settings didn't apply, but the game already looks massively better just by touching that for 5 seconds. Yeah, let's quit to title, reload. Yeah. I would very much like to know what the minimum CPU requirement is for 60 FPS in this game. Let me see. Hey, minimum requirements is a GTX 1060. We meet the minimum spec in GPU performance. We need an 8400. That's their recommended. Really? So, yeah. The minimum CPU for this game is DDR4 and 4 generations newer. Right, so 1080p, VSync off, level of detail is set to ultra, shadow map resolution is maxed, shadow mapping is also maxed. We're getting 240 FPS, and this is being actively 3D rendered. 300 FPS. Seriously? At max settings? Okay, yeah, that's dropping to a more expected range. Yeah, anywhere from 170 to 300 FPS. So, yeah, even on the bridge where you've got all of these beautiful assets and a person, it seems that the game runs absolutely fine. 170 to 300 FPS. Okay, so we're on pretty much the maximum settings. Let's go to an empty test file here. So long as I never save at the first checkpoint, I can just keep playing the intro mission without having to create a new save file every time. We are at 100% GPU usage. But we are getting 60 FPS. Exactly 60. Okay, yeah, now it's dropping. This is a demanding game. I was expecting it to drop. It's not a stupidly demanding game. I mean, if you lower this to the lowest settings, it's actually very easy to get running on weak hardware. But we're testing this game at highest settings. So we're getting 51 FPS. That's a little low, considering this is a very tight action game where you need parry timings and dodge timings to be exact. They are almost frame perfect, some of them. So you'd really want to be hitting 60 FPS rather than 40. Yeah, 40 is worrying. You can't even get into the menu during this section of the game, can you? It looks great. It's running okay, but I definitely need to lower a setting or two. Lowering anti-aliasing down to SMAA, which should lower our VRAM usage quite a bit. And see if that helps. Yeah, having anti-aliasing on 8x is kind of ridiculous and unnecessary, let's say. That explains why our VRAM usage was so high. Seems to be running just fine now. We are very close to dropping frames. Like, we are almost at 90% GPU usage. But I think this should be a much more playable experience. Yep, we're getting a perfect 60 FPS even in this combat encounter. Wow. Yeah, that if this were the only PC I had available and I really wanted to play this game, I would very much enjoy playing this game. This would be perfect. I have no complaints. Yeah, that's all I needed to see. The game runs. GG. As a final test, let's run Dragon Age Inquisition. Just for a bit of fun. This isn't a serious test. I just want to see how well it runs, okay? It apparently pegs my CPU at 100% and endlessly loads. Oh, no. CPU usage went down. It went down, it went down, it went down. And it crashed. Oh, that's the perfect end to this video. That's it, okay? The £40 gaming PC became a £44 gaming PC after selling parts and buying more parts, and it performs admirably in every game that it wants to run. Elden Ring is apparently a bit too much for it, and some games just behave weirdly. Steam has apparently fucked up my Civilization Beyond Earth install. I really don't understand that. Or maybe I just transferred it from another PC and never actually installed it with Steam. I don't know. Regardless, thanks for watching. I don't know how I'm ever going to edit this down to less than an hour, but I'll try. And I'll see you in the next one.